I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing concern that anti-Semitism is on the rise in America and that it's the product of the mood created by President Donald Trump, what critics of Donald Trump characterize as a mood of hatred and bigotry, which fuels anti-Semitism. Now, there's no question that in at least 3 Jewish cemeteries, one in St. Louis, one in Fort Wayne, Indiana, another in Philadelphia, gravestones were turned over, vandalized, desecrated. Of that, there is no dispute. There's also no question that there have been a spate of bomb threats directed at Jewish centers throughout America and at other institutions. Here is a recording of one such bomb threat. We'd like you to hear it.
It's a C4 bomb. There's a lot of shrapnel. Looks like a brick. Surrounded by a bag.
Yes.
Of mental marbles. In a short time, a large number of Jews are going to be slaughtered. Their heads are going to be blown off from the shrapnel. There's a lot of shrapnel. There's going to be a bloodbath that's going to take place in a short time.
It's going to take place in a short time.
I think I told you enough. I must go.
I think it's a woman.
There'll be a bloodbath, a lot of shrapnel. Some 100 threats in 33 different states have been reported since the beginning of this year. Now, the Jewish community must walk a fine line. As we've pointed out before, we may not be ostriches with our heads in the sand. We must see anti-Semitism for what it is. And history has taught us that anti-Semitism is like a most virulent and sometimes lethal virus, which may lay dormant in the body politic many times for years, but then which can be triggered back into life to attack the Jewish organism in a flash. So there's nothing inappropriate with Jews being ever vigilant when it comes to a new outbreak of anti-Semitism. At the same time, we, the American Jewish community, should not see monsters where there are none. Being vigilant does not mean one is an alarmist. Perspective is required. A sober reading of the facts on the ground. The nature of any expression of anti-Semitism must be evaluated. And the rhetoric used to describe any level of anti-Semitism must also be measured and appropriate, and certainly not a fear used for political, partisan gain. Serious questions are now confronting Jewish leadership and the Jewish community as a whole here in the United States. Just how serious is this eruption of apparent anti-Semitism? Is it systematic? Is it coordinated, orchestrated? Does it have any social validation? Or what would be more serious, any governmental sanction? Just how serious should Americans take these bomb threats and cemetery desecrations? And is Donald Trump somehow to blame? Well, one of American Jewry's foremost journalists, Nathan Guttman, Washington correspondent for the Jewish Forward, has written a wonderful piece in the Forward with a headline quoting the opinion of the man who has been in the eye of the anti-Semitic storm for 50 years, Abe Foxman, former national director of the Anti-Defamation League. And the headline on Nathan Guttman's piece reads, Abe Foxman says, wave of anti-Semitic hate is no crisis, and Jews should lay off Trump. Well, to offer some more insight to this entire issue, I'm so pleased to welcome back to JBS on our JBS phones from Washington, Nathan Guttman. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks, Mark, for having me.
Nathan, take us through this, through your piece one by one. You suggested that Abe Foxman's position is that the Jewish community is somewhat overreacting to the threat of anti-Semitism in America. Again, take us through Abe's line of thinking.
Well, I think what Abe Foxman was trying to say is both that the Jewish community is overreacting and that it is not reacting correctly to this wave of anti-Semitism. Foxman doesn't ignore the fact that there is a surge in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States in recent months, and obviously there are numbers that prove that to be true. Anecdotally, from New York City, we know that there are reports of an increase of 55% in the last year, but in the last few months. But what Foxman is trying to say is basically, first of all, this is not the first time. It's a serious issue, but it's not a crisis. We're not facing here something that the American Jewish community has never seen before. We're not facing here the worst of incidents. And of course, he recalls the fact that Jews and non-Jews were actually murdered in anti-Semitic incidents in the past several decades.
Yes.
Be it in attacks on JCCs in Seattle, on Jewish day schools in California, in Chicago, the attack on the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. So definitely horrible incidents have happened in the past. He says, we should take this seriously, but we shouldn't think that the world is coming to an end.
Yes.
And at the same time, he's also warning against turning this into some kind of a political football from either side, which would basically miss the point for the Jewish community. Instead of dealing with anti-Semitism as the serious problem that it is, there's a risk of turning it into a question, are you for Trump or against Trump, which won't advance the cause, according to Foxman again.
Beautifully said. By the way, Trump did refer to anti-Semitism at the beginning of his address to a joint session of Congress after he spoke about it in an African-American ceremony. As you hear Jewish leadership and the Jewish community in general talk about Trump and anti-Semitism, what do you hear, Nathan?
Well, I hear a few things, and some of it really does go back to Foxman's claim that it does basically follow along party lines. More liberal groups tend to see Trump as more responsible to it, whereas more conservative groups are trying to defend Trump and say that while they deplore these acts of anti-Semitism, they have nothing to do with the new administration or with the results of the elections. In general, I would say that the classic Jewish defense organizations, mainly the Anti-Defamation League, but also the American Jewish Committee for one, and others are trying very cautiously to warn against, I'd say, sentiments and undertones and thoughts that have come to surface since Donald Trump joined the race, and more significantly after he won the elections. I think if you ignore the extreme voices on either side, no one is actually arguing that Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, and this whole discussion over Donald Trump's personal views is kind of a distraction. But there is a point that many in the Jewish community are trying to make, which is that his actions, his associations, the time it took him to react to these actions, all these things taken together have created a climate in which anti-Semites, bigots, and extremists felt that they have this opening to speak out. They felt empowered in a way, and that ignited some of these incidents.
Now, what you just said, I want to make sure we understand. Were you expressing your opinion, or were you simply quoting what you've heard Jewish leaders say?
I'd say I was trying to summarize
Yes.
the views that I'm hearing from Jewish leaders.
Okay. it's in that context that it's very interesting to read what Foxman said, as you reported in your forward piece, because he's saying, in essence, as you said, it's a misdirection to make this all about Donald Trump. And, you know, Nathan, we now know that a 31-year-old man was arrested in St. Louis, charged with making at least 8 of the bomb threat calls to the JCC of St. Louis, other JCs around the country, such as the JCC of Manhattan, San Diego, as well as placing some threatening calls, emails, and faxes directed against the ADL headquarters in New York, Museum of Jewish History, Jewish schools in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And it turns out this man was not really motivated out of any deep-seated anti-Semitism. He'd been rejected by a woman who works for a JCC, and his goal was to harass his former girlfriend. He even sent his email threats to the ADL in his girlfriend's name. That's very different than seeing a white supremacy eruption of anti-Semitism somehow spurred on by Donald Trump. What's your reaction to all this?
Oh, there's no doubt that this specific case has nothing to do with white supremacists. The person we're talking about, Juan Thompson, who was arraigned in St. Louis on Friday, basically acted out, as you explained very well. His motivation was to somehow implicate his ex-girlfriend, and that really had nothing to do with any kind of white supremacists or national or bigots raising, and obviously nothing to do with the election.
Exactly.
However, we should note a couple of things. First of all, and it's obvious, but it should be said, even when you call up a Jewish organization and make a threat, even if your motivation is just to harm your girlfriend in some way, that's anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily right-wing or left-wing anti-Semitism, but it definitely is. And the other point is that, yes, this is the first lead that investigators have so far in trying to figure out who is behind these anti-Semitic threat calls to Jewish community centers. He is connected to 8 out of nearly 100 calls. So there's still a lot out there, and obviously the little we know right now, the only person that has been caught or is a suspect has nothing to do with white supremacists. But this is a small portion of the incidents that happened. It doesn't relate to most of the JCC calls, and of course not to the cemetery desecrations.
Yes. What it does suggest, however, is that sometimes anti-Semitism, and you defined it as that, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but sometimes acts of vandalism are not motivated out of some hatred of Jews per se, but out of a certain kind of attempt to do mischief anywhere they can. And yes, they've picked a Jewish target. I'm not saying Jews should ever let an anti-Semitic target incident slide. I'm just saying that what worries me, Nathan, and I'd love you to talk about this for a moment, what worries me is how I see Jews in general reacting to what they now describe as a dark cloud coming over America and raising the specter of something reminiscent of the origins in the 1930s of Nazi Germany, and that there's real anxiety. I read a piece in the Times of Israel by a blogger, a young woman who about to work for a JCC, and she's talking about how terrified she is. And nothing should be ignored, but it seems to me that what your piece was saying, quoting Foxman, was that, while again, we do not put our heads in the sand, there's a little bit of Chicken Little here, and the sky is not falling on American Jewry. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, definitely, I think that is what Foxman was trying to say. That this should be seen in proportion, in historical proportion, and to understand it as part of the problem that America has been struggling with, a problem of anti-Semitism that America has been struggling with for decades. That was his point. I would say that clearly what we've seen in recent weeks, these repeated threats towards JCCs, the vandalism in cemeteries. Now, obviously, some of it will turn out to be the work of copycats or kids or vandals, or like we've seen so far in the case, the only case that was discovered is this weird act of revenge against an ex-girlfriend. But this does come as part of a larger picture that's been playing out since the elections, and that's what's causing many Jews, regardless of their political affiliation, that's what's causing their anxiety, which may be overstated, but it is an anxiety that exists, and that is these anti-Semitic attacks that we've seen against Jewish reporters, is the rise of the alt-right and their hurtful expressions towards Jews and others during the election campaign. All these things taken together. I mean, I can say even anecdotally, the fact that at my kids' school, someone drew a swastika in the bathroom, I really don't think that there are neo-Nazis in the public school system in the D.C. area. The point is that there is this feeling that once these things are let loose, or as Foxman calls it, once you raise the cover of the sewer, these things crawl out. And that's the reason for concern. Looking at this past year, the increase in hate speech and these recent incidents as part of this, that's what's causing this anxiety.
Okay. You said very well, and you represent the position very well. You know, a piece in JNS written by Lori Lowenthal Marcus, by the way, she's an ardent Trump supporter. She tries to point out that she feels there's something here of a media creation, that in truth, it had more to do what you said at the top of the show. There were far more damaging anti-Semitic incidents throughout the preceding decade and a half than the ones that are being reported now, including, and now I'm referring to something you said, the shooting at the Seattle Jewish Federation in 2006, a shooting where 6 women were shot, one of whom died. Or the 2014 murder of 3 people shot to death in the Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City and the retirement community Village Shalom. The head of a Jewish day school in suburban Philadelphia has said the school had almost the same incident in February of last year than it had this year. It followed the same safety procedure, but last year's incident received virtually no attention outside of the local area because it wasn't the same kind of news. Marcus also points out that a Pew study in January shows that positive feelings between and among different American religious groups, it's on the rise. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting Jews shouldn't care about anti-Semitism. I'm only saying that when you talk, Nathan, about a general climate of rhetoric and hate, I honestly wonder what you're specifically referring to. I don't want to hear what people say about Donald Trump. I want you to tell me where you've seen, in general, a greater expression of hate speech or of a mood in general that worries you that the character of America, especially as it applies to Jews, but for that matter, any minority, what have you seen that suggests to you that the tone or mood or character of America has changed since January 20th?
I would say, first of all, I'd dial it back a bit, even before January 20th. I would say that, and it is perfectly true that the sentiments towards Jews in general have not changed. Jews are very well accepted in the American society, very well liked, and the Pew survey demonstrates that in a very clear way, and that is not changing. If anything, Jews are gaining more sympathy than in the past.
Yes.
Whereas hate speech come across, as I mentioned, if you look, and there is an ADL report about that, about hate expressions and anti-Semitic expressions directed at reporters during the elections. I think if you'll ask many in the Jewish community, the fact that anti-Semitic speech existed on Breitbart News before the elections wasn't as significant as it is when Breitbart News becomes a legitimate media outlet for the president, when its former chief becomes a top advisor. That is the kind of differences that create this change of climate for many people who are feeling concerned about this. It doesn't necessarily mean that Jews are under threat in the streets or anything like that. And obviously, thank God we should say, this surge that we're seeing in recent months of anti-Semitic incidents has so far ended without any casualties or anyone injured. So definitely that is true, but the atmosphere of hate speech certainly exists.
And just so I'm clear, is this something you've experienced personally? Did anybody target you during the election and either send you hate mail, or did they send you?
I've experienced a couple of incidents of hate mails and hate speech in the past 6 months. And again, it's not the first time that this has happened. I never had more than one in a very long time, so this was a little more. But I think most reporters that covered these elections experienced that. I found my name on a list of reporters that some kind of neo-Nazi group put out and called its supporters to flood their homes with leaflets and stuff like that. So yeah, I've experienced it, but really not. It's not my personal story here. It's really insignificant. But as the ADL report very clearly lists, there are journalists who suffered real anti-Semitic hate talk on Twitter and online and in personal mail that they got, and even in threats to their homes.
Mm-hmm. You never felt vulnerable, did you?
No, not for a moment.
Okay. All right. This is a discussion we've had multiple times on JBS. And again, maybe, Nathan, it's because we're in New York. JBS comes out of New York City. We're not a daily newspaper. We are on the air 24 hours a day. I have seen nothing. Nobody that I know has come and said to me, "Look, Mark, look at this," But if you and I were friends in Washington and somebody put you on a list or they drew a picture of you, I would be offended for you. And again, a Jew is always looking over his shoulder. Right. By the way, Nathan, I still meet many Jews who tell me that while Donald Trump makes them uncomfortable in many ways, and that he did not have the experience, nor did he have the credentials to become president of the United States. They say they feel good because they think he'll be good for Israel.
I perfectly agree. I spent last weekend covering the conference of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and I've met there many Republican activists and donors, and even people who are not Republican, who said, yeah, Donald Trump wasn't our first choice. We don't like his style. We didn't like him during the campaign, but we support him because we believe that he'll be better for Israel. Definitely, that sentiment definitely exists in the community.
So you hear that also. I also hear Jews saying that President Trump is so short on foreign policy. One never knows what his position on Israel is going to be from one moment to the next, and they fear, Nathan, Trump turning on Israel. Do you hear anything like that from the people you speak with?
Well, I wouldn't say that I hear them fearing that he will turn on Israel, but they just feel a little insecure because they see, at least now in the first 6-7 weeks of his presidency, they see his foreign policy as being a little erratic, and there is no clear address for foreign policy setting. Secretary of State Tillerson is not playing a dominant role right now. It's not really clear 100% what President Trump's plans are in general in foreign policy, and specifically on the Middle East. So I think for many people who follow this closely and who care deeply about Israel, they have a sense that he'll get along well with Netanyahu, as he does, but they also have a sense that there isn't yet anything that they can point out as a Trump policy or a Trump doctrine or a Trump plan. Mm-hmm. And once that will be out, and once it will be clear exactly where he's going, I think many will feel more safe and positive about him.
Okay. You know, Nathan, it's very hard for me to believe Donald Trump will ever turn on Israel when his son-in-law Jared Kushner is at his side. Does that make any sense to you?
I'd say that definitely. I mean, from what we know about Jared Kushner, his Jewish upbringing, his observance, his family's ties to Israel, clearly he has a real sentiment towards Israel. But here's the thing. We don't know much about his foreign policy experience or beliefs, for that matter. And it's not really clear up to now what his role exactly is in the Oval Office.
Yes.
We hear a lot of reports of him being very important, but just exactly how does it work? Because we're entering this new world in which the close advisors aren't people that we knew before from within the system. The way things operate in the White House are different. The way this president thinks is different than anything we know. So, yes, Jared Kushner could have a very positive influence on President Trump in terms of his policy towards Israel and the Middle East. But again, it's not really clear what the mechanism is and what exactly his views are.
Okay. You do fabulous work, Nathan. We are going to rely on your eyes and ears to help keep us informed. Keep up the wonderful work. Love what you write. And it's always wonderful to speak with you. So I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha. We will speak again very soon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being on your show.
Thank you. The thoughts of Nathan Guttman, Washington correspondent for the Jewish Forward. And I find myself in this instance very much in line with Abe Foxman. I believe it's necessary to always watch out for anti-Semitism, but we should not make more of it than it is, and I'm very uncomfortable when it's laid at the feet of Donald Trump. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and the producers of this edition of In the News, Kara Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.